Before inheriting my grandmother's house, I was just another struggling writer in the city, desperately seeking inspiration for my next novel. I never believed in small-town conspiracies or supernatural occurrences. How naive I was, how unprepared for the horrors that awaited me in that seemingly quaint rural community. The lawyer's voice droned on as he read Grandma's will, but all I could focus on was the old iron key he'd placed before me. It was the key to her house, my house now, in the little town of Millbrook. As a child, I'd spent summers there, enchanted by the creaky old Victorian and its overgrown garden. But there was always one strict rule: never, ever go near the covered well in the backyard. "It's dangerous," Grandma would say, her eyes dark with an emotion I couldn't quite place. "Promise me you'll stay away." I'd promised, of course. But now, as I drove into Millbrook for the first time in 15 years, that promise felt as dusty and forgotten as the house itself. The townsfolk were polite but distant as I settled in. Their smiles never quite reached their eyes, and conversations would stop abruptly when I entered the local diner. I chalked it up to small-town wariness of outsiders. If only I'd recognized it for the warning it was. For the first week, I respected Grandma's wishes. But with each passing day, my curiosity grew. What could be so dangerous about an old well? One muggy afternoon, I found myself in the backyard, staring at the weathered wooden cover. My hands trembled as I lifted the heavy lid. The musty smell of stagnant water hit me first, followed by something far worse, a putrid stench that made my stomach churn. Gagging, I peered into the darkness below. At first, I saw nothing but inky blackness. Then, a flicker of movement caught my eye. Something was stirring in the murky depths. My heart raced as I leaned closer, straining to see. Suddenly, a whisper drifted up from the well, so faint I almost missed it. "Help us," it seemed to say, the words barely more than a sigh on the wind. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. Surely, I'd imagined it. Wells don't whisper. But as I turned to flee, another voice rose from the depths, clearer this time. "We know what they did," it hissed, the words dripping with malice. Slamming the cover back in place, I ran into the house, locking the door behind me. But even through the walls, I could hear them, a chorus of whispers, growing louder with each passing moment, eager to share their terrible secrets. Sleep eluded me that night, the whispers from the well seeping into my dreams. By dawn, I found myself drawn back to the yard, a mix of terror and morbid curiosity propelling me forward. As I lifted the cover again, the voices erupted, no longer whispers but a cacophony of revelations. They spoke of dark deeds hidden beneath Millbrook's quaint exterior. Mayor Jenkins drowned his wife in Crescent Lake, one voice hissed. Another chimed in, the Reverend's missing daughters? Sacrificed in the old church basement. Horror gripped me as the voices continued, each revelation more gruesome than the last. Murders concealed as accidents, children vanishing without a trace, occult rituals performed under the cover of darkness. The history of Millbrook was written in blood and secrecy. I recognized names, pillars of the community, people I'd known since childhood. How could this be true? Yet the voices spoke with such conviction, such detail, that doubt was impossible. As the sun climbed higher, I remained rooted to the spot, absorbing the town's dark chronicle. The voices seemed eager to share, as if they'd been waiting years for someone to listen. "Why are you telling me this?" I finally managed to ask. The reply came in unison, chilling me to the bone, "Because now you're part of it. They'll never let you leave with our secrets." Shaken to my core, I knew I couldn't keep this to myself. The next morning, I went to the sheriff's office, my hands trembling as I recounted what I'd heard. Sheriff Tanner listened impassively, his face an unreadable mask. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Son, that old well's been dry for decades. Sounds like you've been working too hard on that novel of yours." I pressed on, desperation creeping into my voice. But the voices, the secrets they revealed, enough. Tanner cut me off, his tone sharp. "I won't have you spreading lies about respectable folk. Go home and get some rest." Dejected, I tried the local newspaper next. The editor, Mrs. Crandall, listened with growing alarm, not at my story, but at me for telling it. "We don't print ghost stories or slander," she said firmly, showing me the door. With each dismissal, a sense of isolation grew. The townsfolk, once politely distant, now actively avoided me. Whispers followed me down the street, and doors closed as I approached. I was alone with the knowledge of Millbrook's sins, and the growing certainty that I was in grave danger. As days turned into weeks, the atmosphere in Millbrook grew increasingly oppressive. Friendly smiles were replaced by wary glances and hushed conversations that abruptly ceased when I approached. I felt eyes on me constantly, watching, judging, waiting. One evening, as I picked up groceries at the local store, Mr. Peterson, the owner, gripped my arm. "You should have left well enough alone, boy," he hissed, his eyes darting nervously. "Some secrets are meant to stay buried." Walking home, I noticed shadows moving behind curtains, faces quickly disappearing from windows. The town was closing ranks, and I was on the outside. The threats became less veiled. My tires were slashed. A brick sailed through my window one night, wrapped in a note that simply read, "Leave or else." But where could I go? The voices from the well had made it clear. The town would never let me leave with their secrets. I began to understand the true nature of Millbrook. It wasn't just a few bad apples. The entire town was complicit in decades of horror. The well wasn't just a repository of secrets. It was the town's dark heart, pulsing with the weight of countless atrocities. As I sat in my dimly lit kitchen, jumping at every creak and shadow, I realized with growing dread that I had only two choices: become part of Millbrook's conspiracy of silence, or face the consequences of my knowledge. The sound of breaking glass jolted me awake. Heart pounding, I realized with horror that they had come for me. Shadows moved through the house, whispered instructions floating up the stairs. I scrambled for my phone, but the line was dead. As I turned to the window, considering a desperate escape, my bedroom door burst open. Silhouetted in the doorway stood Mayor Jenkins, Reverend Hartley, and several other town elders. "It's time, son," Jenkins said, his voice eerily calm. "You know too much. But don't worry, the well has room for one more secret." Rough hands grabbed me. I fought, screamed, but it was useless. They dragged me down the stairs, out into the cool night air. The entire town seemed to be there, a sea of familiar faces now twisted with grim purpose. As they pulled me towards the well, I saw the truth in their eyes. This wasn't the first time they'd done this. How many others had discovered Millbrook's secrets only to be silenced forever? The well's cover was already removed, its dark maw waiting to swallow yet another victim. As they pushed me towards the edge, I realized the voices had been right all along. Standing at the well's edge, I gazed into the inky abyss below. The voices were silent now, as if holding their breath in anticipation. In that moment, I understood the terrible symmetry of my situation. I had come seeking inspiration for a novel, only to become another chapter in Millbrook's dark saga. "Any last words?" Mayor Jenkins sneered. I turned to face the crowd, these people I'd known all my life, now revealed as monsters. "The well always speaks the truth," I said, my voice steady despite my fear. Then, with a final push, I plunged into the darkness, becoming one with the secrets I had tried to unveil. They say the well whispers louder now, with a new voice added to its chorus. Visitors to Millbrook sometimes claim to hear a writer's voice among the whispers, still trying to tell the town's story. But in Millbrook, secrets stay secrets, no matter how loudly they cry to be heard. 2 years have passed since I fled that small town, yet the memories still haunt me, as vivid and terrifying as the day they were born. Before moving there, I was just another burnt-out city dweller, a software engineer desperate for a change of pace. I never believed in the supernatural, always priding myself on my logical mind. How naive I was, how unprepared for the horrors that awaited me in that seemingly idyllic rural community. The real estate agent's smile was a touch too wide as she handed me the keys to my new home. "You'll love it here," she said, her eyes never quite meeting mine. "It's so peaceful." At first, I did love it. My little house sat on the edge of town, backdropped by a vast cornfield that stretched to the horizon. The first few nights, I slept better than I had in years, lulled by the gentle rustle of corn leaves in the breeze. During the day, I'd work remotely from my porch, enjoying the sun and the simple beauty of my surroundings. The locals were polite, if a bit reserved, and I relished the slower pace of life. But as summer faded into autumn, things began to change. The cornfield, once a source of tranquility, began to feel watchful. It started on a moonless night in late September. I was drifting off to sleep when I heard it, a whisper, so faint I almost missed it. My name, carried on the wind from the direction of the cornfield. I dismissed it as a dream, but the whispers continued, growing clearer with each passing night. They were always just on the edge of comprehension, like a radio station not quite tuned in. But my name, they always said my name with chilling clarity. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the wind, or my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. One night, unable to sleep, I stood at my bedroom window, staring out at the moonlit cornfield. The whispers came again, louder this time. "Help us," they seemed to say. "Join us." A chill ran down my spine as I saw movement among the cornstalks. Something pale flitted between the rows, too quick to be human, too deliberate to be animal. I stumbled back from the window, heart pounding. As I huddled in my bed, I realized the peace I'd sought in this small town had been an illusion. Something dark and ancient lurked in that cornfield, and it knew my name. As autumn deepened, my nights became a torment of whispers and shadowy movements. But it was on All Hallows' Eve when I saw them clearly for the first time. I was walking home late, the harvest moon casting long shadows across the road. The cornfield rustled in a wind I couldn't feel. Then I saw them, pale, emaciated figures moving between the stalks. Their eyes were hollow, their mouths open in silent screams. Frozen in terror, I watched as one turned to look at me. Its gaze pierced my soul, filled with an ancient hunger and despair. In that moment, I understood these weren't mere ghosts, but something far more sinister. I ran home, locking every door and window. But the whispers followed, seeping through the walls, calling my name with increasing urgency. Sleep became elusive. Every noise made me jump, every shadow seemed to move. I began to question my sanity. Were these visions real, or was I losing my mind? As days passed, the line between reality and nightmare blurred. The entities in the cornfield grew bolder, venturing closer to my house each night. I knew I needed help, but who would believe me? Desperate for answers, I started asking around town, but my questions were met with evasive glances and nervous laughter. Old houses creak. The local handyman shrugged when I mentioned the whispers. Probably just coyotes. The sheriff dismissed my sightings of figures in the field. But I caught the fear in their eyes, the way conversations would stop when I entered the local diner. They knew something, I was sure of it. One night at the bar, loosened by whiskey, old Tom leaned in close. "Best not to ask questions about that field," he slurred. "Some things are better left buried." Before I could press him for more, the bartender shooed him away with a sharp look. I realized then that the entire town was in on it. Whatever secret the cornfield held, they were determined to keep it hidden, even if it meant sacrificing newcomers like me. Isolated and increasingly paranoid, I turned to the town's historical records. Hours in the dusty library basement revealed a chilling truth. 70 years ago, a devastating drought had gripped the region. Crops withered, livestock died, and the town faced starvation. In their desperation, the town elders turned to darker powers. An ancient tome spoke of a ritual, a sacrifice to ensure bountiful harvests. The price? 7 souls, one for each year of plenty. With mounting horror, I read accounts of 7 disappearances that year. The drought broke, and the cornfields flourished as never before. But the pact demanded renewal. Every 7 years, a newcomer would vanish, their soul bound to the cornfield. The whispers I heard were the trapped souls, seeking release or company. As I pieced it together, a terrible realization dawned. I had arrived just as the 7th year was ending. I was to be the next sacrifice. Suddenly, the town's behavior made sense. Their initial welcome, followed by growing unease as the time approached. They weren't just keeping a secret, they were fattening the lamb for slaughter. That night, as a harvest moon rose blood-red over the cornfield, they came for me. The entire town, led by the elders, their eyes gleaming with fervent purpose. I ran, but the cornfield seemed to move, herding me deeper into its depths. Pale figures emerged from the stalks, their bony hands reaching for me. In that moment, faced with the horrors of both the living and the dead, I made a desperate choice. I grabbed a fallen corn stalk and sparked my lighter. As flames engulfed the field, agonized screams, both human and otherworldly, filled the air. The pact was broken, but at what cost? I was just another burnt-out journalist in the city, searching for a story that could reignite my passion for writing. I never believed in small-town conspiracies or occult practices. How naive I was, how unprepared for the horrors that awaited me in that seemingly idyllic rural community. The "Welcome to Millbrook" sign gleamed in the afternoon sun as I drove past, my car packed with the remnants of my city life. The quaint Main Street, lined with mom-and-pop shops and friendly faces, seemed like a scene from a Norman Rockwell painting. My new home, a charming cottage on Elm Street, felt like a fresh start. Neighbors brought over homemade pies and casseroles, their smiles warm and welcoming. Sheriff Thompson himself stopped by to introduce himself, his handshake firm and reassuring. In those first few weeks, I felt I'd found paradise. The clean air, the sense of community, the peace and quiet, it was everything I'd hoped for when I left the city behind. I threw myself into small-town life, attending local events and getting to know the residents. If only I'd known what lurked beneath Millbrook's picture-perfect surface. It was a moonless night in late October when everything changed. I was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps, soft but unmistakable, coming from the street outside. Curious, I peered through my bedroom window, and what I saw chilled me to the bone. A procession of hooded figures moved silently down the middle of the road, their faces hidden in shadow. Each carried a flickering candle, the warm glow a stark contrast to the eerie scene. At the center of the group, four figures bore a wooden casket on their shoulders. My journalistic instincts kicked in, overriding my fear. I had to know where they were going, what they were doing. Grabbing my coat and shoes, I slipped out of the house, careful not to make a sound. I followed at a distance, my heart pounding in my chest. The procession wound its way through town, past the darkened shops and houses, towards the dense forest at the edge of Millbrook. As they entered the tree lane, I hesitated. Every fiber of my being screamed to turn back, to forget what I'd seen. But my curiosity won out, and I plunged into the darkness after them, unaware that I was walking into a nightmare from which I might never wake. I stumbled through the dark forest, guided only by the faint glimmer of candlelight ahead. The procession moved with an unnatural sureness, as if following a path invisible to my eyes. After what felt like hours, we emerged into a moonlit clearing. My breath caught in my throat. In the center of the clearing stood a stone altar, ancient and ominous. The hooded figures formed a circle around it, their chanting a low, discordant hum that seemed to vibrate through the earth itself. With horror, I watched as they placed the casket on the altar. The chanting grew louder as one figure, taller than the rest, approached the casket and threw back the lid. The stench of decay filled the air, making me gag. Inside lay a corpse, mummified and ancient. But as I watched, unable to look away, its eyes snapped open. A rasping voice, like dry leaves scraping stone, began to speak. It spoke of disasters to come, of death and destruction that would befall the world. Each word seemed to pulse with a terrible power. Suddenly, the figures began to lower their hoods. I stifled a gasp as I recognized familiar faces. Sheriff Thompson, Mayor Wells, even kindly Mrs. Anderson from the bakery. The entire town was here, participating in this macabre ritual. As the mummy's prophecies reached a fever pitch, I felt a surge of panic. I had to get out of there, had to tell someone what I'd seen. But as I turned to flee, my foot snapped a twig. The chanting stopped abruptly. Dozens of eyes turned in my direction. Heart pounding, I ran. Branches whipped at my face as I crashed through the underbrush, the sounds of pursuit close behind. I could hear them calling my name, their voices a mockery of the friendly tones I'd grown accustomed to. I burst out of the forest, gasping for air, and sprinted down Main Street. But the town I knew was gone. Windows that should have been dark glowed with an eerie light. Shadows moved behind curtains, and I could swear I saw faces, twisted, inhuman faces, peering out at me. As I rounded a corner, I slammed into a solid form. Looking up, I met Sheriff Thompson's eyes. But they weren't the warm, friendly eyes I knew. They were cold, filled with an ancient malevolence. Now, he said, his voice unnaturally calm. There's no need to run. You're one of us now. Hands grabbed me from behind. I struggled, but it was useless. As a sweet-smelling cloth was pressed over my nose and mouth, I saw the hooded figures emerging from the shadows all around me. My last thought before darkness took me was a chilling realization. In Millbrook, there were no outsiders. Only those who hadn't been initiated yet. I awoke in a dimly lit room, the air thick with the scent of incense and decay. My head throbbed, and when I tried to move, I found my wrists and ankles bound to a cold stone slab. Panic rose in my throat as the events of the night came rushing back. Mayor Wells stepped into view, his kindly facade gone, replaced by a look of grim determination. "You've seen too much," he said, his voice eerily calm. "But fear not. You'll understand soon enough. Over the next hours, days, Time lost all meaning. They force-fed me a viscous, foul-tasting liquid that made my veins burn and my mind swim. Between doses, they spoke of the Great Transformation and the eternal cycle. I learned, in fragmented conversations and feverish visions, that Millbrook had existed for centuries, its inhabitants bound by an ancient pact. The mummified prophet in the woods was their source of power and foresight, but it required a host, a living vessel to channel its prophecies. And I, in my unwitting curiosity, had been chosen as the next vessel. The changes began subtly. My skin grew pale and taut, my eyes sunken. The strange substance they fed me seemed to be hollowing me out, preparing me for something else. In my more lucid moments, I could feel a presence pushing at the edges of my consciousness. Ancient, powerful, and utterly alien. It whispered of futures too terrible to comprehend, of cosmic horrors beyond human understanding. I tried to resist, to cling to my sense of self, but it was like trying to hold on to smoke. With each passing day, more of me slipped away, replaced by the otherworldly entity that would soon inhabit my body. The townsfolk visited regularly, their eyes gleaming with a mix of reverence and fear. They spoke of the honor bestowed upon me, of the great purpose I would serve. But all I felt was a creeping dread as my transformation neared its completion. Now, I am both observer and observed. My body walks among them, spouting prophecies I don't understand. I watch through eyes that are no longer mine as a new family moves into my old house. And I know, with a certainty that chills what's left of my soul, that the cycle will begin anew. If you're reading this, you've found the warning I managed to scrawl in my last moments of lucidity. Heed it well. Millbrook is not what it seems. The friendly smiles hide ancient horrors. If you value your soul, your very being, turn back now, before it's too late. I never believed in the supernatural or small-town conspiracies. How naive I was. How unprepared for the horrors that awaited me in that seemingly picturesque rural community. The Welcome to Vale das Cruzes sign gleamed in the late afternoon sun as I drove past, my car packed with books and the remnants of my city life. The quaint main street, lined with mom-and-pop shops and friendly faces, seemed like a scene from a Norman Rockwell painting. My new home, a charming cottage on Elm Street, felt like a fresh start. Neighbors brought over homemade pies and casseroles, their smiles warm and welcoming. Principal Thompson himself stopped by to introduce himself, his handshake firm and reassuring. In those first few weeks, I felt I'd found paradise. The clean air, the sense of community, the peace and quiet, it was everything I'd hoped for when I left the city behind. I threw myself into small-town life, getting to know my students and their families. But there was one thing that struck me as odd from the very beginning. At the center of town stood an imposing Gothic church, its spire reaching towards the heavens. While it was a beautiful building, I couldn't help but notice how people seemed to hurry past it after sunset, their eyes averted and steps quickened. When I asked about it, I was met with nervous laughs and changed subjects. "Oh, that's just an old superstition," they'd say, but their eyes told a different story. Little did I know, that church would become the center of a nightmare I could never have imagined. As the weeks passed, I began to notice other peculiarities about Vale das Cruzes. My students, usually chatty and full of life, would grow quiet and evasive when discussions veered towards local history or traditions. Parents at school meetings would exchange meaningful glances when certain topics arose, a silent communication I couldn't decipher. But it was the church that continued to dominate my thoughts. During the day, it stood silent and empty, its doors firmly locked. But at night, I could swear I saw movement in its windows, fleeting shadows that seemed to dance just at the edge of my vision. One evening, as I was grading papers, I heard a sound that chilled me to the bone, a low, rhythmic chanting coming from the direction of the church. Curious and unnerved, I approached my window and peered out into the darkness. What I saw made my blood run cold. A procession of shadowy figures was moving towards the church, their forms indistinct in the dim streetlights. As they passed under a lamp, I realized with shock that they weren't carrying anything. The shadows seemed to be emanating from them, writhing and twisting in impossible ways. I blinked, certain I was seeing things. When I looked again, the street was empty, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the cool night breeze. The next day, I casually mentioned the strange sight to a colleague. The color drained from her face, and she quickly changed the subject, her hands shaking slightly as she gathered her things. It was then that I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my core, that something was very wrong in Vale das Cruzes. And somehow, that church was at the center of it all. As autumn deepened, my curiosity about the church grew into an obsession. I found myself staying up late, watching from my window, catching glimpses of those shadowy processions. But it wasn't enough. I needed to know what was happening inside those hallowed walls. On All Hallows' Eve, I made my decision. As the town fell silent and dark, I slipped out of my house and made my way towards the church. The streets were deserted, an unnatural stillness hanging in the air. As I approached the imposing structure, I could hear a low, rhythmic chanting emanating from within. With trembling hands, I pushed open the heavy wooden door. The sight that greeted me will haunt me for the rest of my days. The pews were filled with townspeople, but they were unlike I'd ever seen them. They sat perfectly still, their eyes completely black, reflecting the flickering candlelight. Not a single head turned as I entered. They were transfixed on the figure at the pulpit. It was a creature of shadow and nightmare, vaguely humanoid but constantly shifting and writhing. Its voice, if you could call it that, seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my mind, speaking of ancient pacts and cosmic horrors beyond human comprehension. As I stood there, paralyzed with fear, the shadow priest turned its attention to me. Its face, if you could call it that, split into a grin that revealed row upon row of needle-sharp teeth. "Welcome, teacher," it said, its voice a discordant whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "We've been expecting you." Panic surged through me, breaking the spell of horror that had held me in place. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the cold stone floor. Behind me, I heard movement, the scraping of pews and the shuffle of feet. The congregation was awakening. I burst out of the church and into the night, not daring to look back. The streets that had been empty moments before were now filled with shadowy figures, their forms blurring and twisting in impossible ways. Hands made of darkness reached for me, their touch icy and wrong. Somehow, I made it back to my house, slamming the door behind me and collapsing against it, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. The next day, I woke hoping it had all been a terrible nightmare. But the scratches on my arms from those shadowy hands told a different story. At school, everything seemed normal, but there was a tension in the air, a watchfulness that hadn't been there before. My students avoided my gaze, and my colleagues gave me a wide berth. In the staff room, I overheard whispers. "He knows. What should we do?" That evening, as I sat in my living room, trying to make sense of what I'd seen, I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. A shadow, darker and more solid than it should be, detached itself from the wall and began to creep towards me. I realized with growing horror that my nightmare was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. In the days that followed, I threw myself into researching Vale das Cruzes' history, desperate to understand what I had witnessed. The town library, a quaint building that had always seemed inviting, now felt oppressive. As I pored over old newspapers and town records, I could feel eyes on me, watching, judging. Most of the town's history seemed mundane, but there were gaps, unexplained periods where records simply stopped. And always, at the center of it all, was the church. It had been rebuilt several times over the centuries, always on the same spot, always after some vaguely described tragedy. I tried reaching out to colleagues in neighboring towns, but my emails went unanswered, and phone calls were cut short by static and strange whispers on the line. It was as if Vale das Cruzes was being slowly erased from the outside world. One night, an elderly librarian approached me, her eyes darting nervously. "You're digging too deep," she whispered, slipping me a weathered journal. This belonged to the last person who asked questions. "Read it, then burn it. And for God's sake, stay away from the church after dark." The journal was a descent into madness, filled with frantic scribblings about shadow people and the thing in the pulpit. But among the ramblings were pieces of a terrible truth. Vale das Cruzes had made a pact centuries ago with entities from beyond our reality, trading worship for prosperity and protection. As I delved deeper into this forbidden knowledge, the supernatural events around me intensified. Shadows moved of their own accord in my peripheral vision. At night, I'd wake to find my room filled with inky darkness that slowly retreated to the corners when I turned on the lights. At school, students would sometimes speak in unison, their voices overlapping in an unsettling chorus. Once, during a lesson, every student in my class turned to look at me simultaneously, their eyes completely black for just a moment before returning to normal. I tried to leave town, but every attempt was thwarted. My car wouldn't start, buses were mysteriously canceled, and the road out of town seemed to loop back on itself endlessly. The townsfolk's behavior towards me changed dramatically. Some avoided me entirely, while others watched me with a mixture of pity and hunger in their eyes. I overheard hushed conversations. "He's not one of us yet. The shadows will decide." One evening, as I was walking home, Mayor Thompson approached me. His friendly demeanor was gone, replaced by a grim determination. "You have a choice to make, teacher," he said, his voice unnaturally deep. "Embrace the shadows, or become one of them. There is no leaving Vale das Cruzes." As he walked away, I saw his shadow detach itself and slither across the ground towards me. I ran, but I knew the truth. There was nowhere left to hide. It all came to a head on a moonless night. I was cornered in the town square, surrounded by the entire population of Vale das Cruzes. Their eyes were black voids, their shadows writhing around them like living things. The church doors creaked open, and the shadow priest emerged, its form more solid than I'd ever seen it. "You've been quite troublesome," it hissed, its voice scraping against my mind. "But now you understand. Vale das Cruzes has always been ours. We offer protection, prosperity, immortality, for a price." As it spoke, I saw the truth. The townspeople weren't victims. They were willing participants. They had traded their humanity for the shadow's gifts, becoming something no longer fully human. "Join us," the shadow priest offered, extending a tendril of darkness towards me. "Or become fuel for our continued existence. The choice is yours." In that moment, facing the horrifying truth of Vale das Cruzes, I made my choice. I ran, not away, but towards the church. If this was the source of their power, maybe it could also be their weakness. The shadowy congregation surged after me, their inhuman shrieks filling the air. I crashed through the church doors, my eyes frantically searching for anything that could help. There, on the altar, I saw it, an ancient, pulsing artifact, clearly the linchpin of this unholy pact. Without hesitation, I grabbed it and smashed it against the ground. The world exploded into chaos. I woke up miles from Vale das Cruzes, with no memory of how I escaped. The town no longer appears on any map, and no one seems to remember it ever existed. But sometimes in the dark of night, I still see shadows moving where they shouldn't, and I wonder, did I truly escape? Before buying that cursed property, I was just another ambitious real estate investor, always on the lookout for the next big deal. I had a knack for finding undervalued properties and turning them into gold mines. How naive I was. How unprepared for the horror that awaited me in that seemingly idyllic rural estate. The listing seemed too good to be true. A sprawling farmhouse with acres of land, all for a fraction of its market value. As I drove down the winding country road, the overgrown fields and dilapidated barn only excited me more. This was the opportunity I'd been waiting for. The real estate agent seemed nervous, rushing through the tour and avoiding certain areas of the property. I chalked it up to the place's run-down state. All I saw was potential. "Why is it priced so low?" I asked, already mentally calculating my profits. "The owners are eager to sell," she replied, her eyes darting around. "Family disputes, you know how it is." I should have noticed her relief when I signed the papers, should have questioned why no one else had snatched up this deal. But I was too blinded by ambition. As I stood on the porch that first evening, watching the sun set over my new empire, I felt a sense of unease creep over me. Something about the lengthening shadows felt wrong, almost alive. If only I'd trusted that instinct and left right then. The first few days were a flurry of activity as I made plans for renovations and land use. But as I settled into the rhythms of country life, I began to notice things that didn't add up. It started with the footprints. Massive, canine-like tracks that appeared overnight around the house. At first, I dismissed them as belonging to a stray dog, but their size and depth suggested something much larger. Then the livestock started disappearing. I'd invested in a small herd of cattle, seeing it as a quaint side business to my main plans. But every few nights, another would vanish without a trace. No blood, no struggle, just gone. The locals were no help. Whenever I brought up the strange occurrences, they'd change the subject or suddenly remember urgent business elsewhere. Their averted gazes and hushed whispers only fueled my growing paranoia. Nights became a torment. The house creaked and groaned in ways that seemed impossible for mere settling. Sometimes, I'd wake to the sound of heavy breathing outside my window, only to find nothing there when I looked. One evening, as I walked the property line at dusk, I felt eyes on me. Turning towards the dense woods that bordered the farm, I caught a glimpse of something. A pair of glowing red eyes, watching me from the shadows. In that moment, I knew with chilling certainty that I was no longer the predator in this investment game. I had become the prey. It was a moonless night when everything changed. I was jolted awake by the sound of splintering wood and terrified animal cries coming from the barn. Grabbing my shotgun, I rushed out, my heart pounding in my chest. The air was thick with a metallic scent of blood and something else, something musky and wild. As I approached the barn, an unnatural silence fell. My flashlight beam trembled as I pushed open the creaking door. What I saw inside will haunt me for the rest of my days. It was crouched over the carcass of one of my prized bulls, a creature straight out of nightmares. Larger than any wolf, with matted fur caked in blood and dirt. But it wasn't just an animal. Its body was twisted, caught between beast and man. As my light hit its eyes, they glowed an infernal red. It turned to face me, lips pulling back in a snarl to reveal rows of dagger-like teeth. In that moment, I saw intelligence in those eyes, a malevolent awareness that no mere animal should possess. I fired my shotgun on pure instinct. The blast echoed through the barn, but the creature moved with impossible speed. It was on me in an instant, its hot breath on my face, claws raking across my chest. I felt a searing pain and then nothing. I woke up at dawn, lying in the blood-soaked hay. The creature was gone, but its presence lingered like a foul stench. As I stumbled back to the house, my mind reeling, I knew my life would never be the same. In the days that followed, I threw myself into researching the property's history, desperate to understand what I had seen. The local library, a quaint building that had always seemed inviting, now felt oppressive. As I pored over old newspapers and land records, I could feel eyes on me, watching, judging. Most of the farm's history seemed mundane, but there were gaps, unexplained periods where records simply stopped. And always, at the center of it all, was the original family, the Blackwoods. I discovered that Jeremiah Blackwood, the patriarch who had built the farm centuries ago, was rumored to have made a pact with dark forces for prosperity. The details were vague, but one phrase kept appearing: the land must be fed. As I dug deeper, I began to feel changes in myself. My senses sharpened. I felt stronger, more alive. But with these changes came disturbing urges, a hunger I couldn't explain. One night, as I paced my study, I caught my reflection in the window. For a moment, my eyes glowed red in the darkness. I realized with growing horror that I hadn't just bought a property. I had inherited a curse. As weeks passed, the changes became impossible to ignore. My body was reshaping itself, muscles bulging and bones shifting in ways that defied medical explanation. Coarse hair began to sprout across my skin, and my teeth sharpened to points that cut my tongue when I spoke. But the physical changes paled in comparison to the mental ones. My senses became hyperacute. I could hear heartbeats from rooms away and smell fear on people before they even knew they were afraid. Worst of all were the urges, a primal hunger that gnawed at my insides, demanding to be sated. I tried to fight it. I chained myself in the basement during full moons, ate raw meat to quell the cravings. But nothing worked. Each night, I'd wake to find the chains broken, blood on my hands, and no memory of what I'd done. Desperate, I reached out to doctors, paranormal experts, even local shamans. But as soon as I mentioned the property, they'd go pale and refuse to help. One old woman, her eyes wide with fear, whispered, "The land has chosen you. There's no escaping its hunger." As my humanity slipped away, I became a prisoner in my own home. I couldn't risk going into town, couldn't bear the thought of what I might do to innocent people. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had bought this land to make my fortune, and now it owned me completely. It all came to a head on the night of the harvest moon. As darkness fell, I felt the change coming on stronger than ever before. The bones in my face began to shift, my spine elongating, nails turning to claws. Fighting the transformation with every ounce of my fading humanity, I dragged myself to Jeremiah Blackwood's grave at the edge of the property. The weathered tombstone seemed to leer at me in the moonlight. "Why?" I growled, my voice barely human. "Why me?" As if in answer, the wind picked up, carrying whispers of the past. I saw visions of Jeremiah making his dark bargain, of generations of Blackwoods serving as the land's guardians and sacrifices. I understood then, the land needed a keeper, a protector to maintain the balance between our world and something much darker. As the moon reached its zenith, I faced my choice. I could give in to the beast entirely, losing the last shreds of my humanity but gaining unimaginable power. Or I could fight it one last time, possibly destroying myself in the process. With a howl that was part anguish, part defiance, I made my decision. To hear more stories like this, subscribe and leave a like.